Hey everybody, welcome to the beginner series of .NET on Azure. My name is Matt Soucoup and we are going to cover all things of .NET on Azure, and we're going to start at the very beginning. We're going to talk about really what is cloud computing. So that is the very start. So I'm going to suppose that you know absolutely nothing about Azure. But as we go along, we're going to get deeper and deeper into developing .NET applications on Azure. So we're going to cover the whole gamut of everything. So this is going to be a lot of fun, and I really hope you do enjoy this whole series of .NET on Azure. So let's get started on everything that we're going to cover. So as I mentioned, the first thing we're going to talk about is what exactly is cloud computing from the very start of everything. And then we're going to get into some use cases of .NET on Azure. And then last in this episode, we're going to talk about setting up our development environment. So really just getting our computer right here set up so we can start creating .NET applications on Azure. So first off, let's talk about exactly what is cloud computing. What are we going to build for our .NET applications so we can run them up in the cloud? So really, the cloud is a computer but somebody else's infrastructure, right? It's plugged in somewhere else. It has a network cable, it has the power. It's not running in your power center. Or as I used to when I developed at a state government, it wasn't a computer sitting underneath my desk. That's a little bit of an exaggeration, but not too much. And so what happens in addition for it to not being your own infrastructure, cloud computing also has platforms to increase developer productivity and velocity. And so some things you can think about where the infrastructure are things like Azure Storage, so blob storage or virtual machines. The platforms to increase your velocity become Azure Functions or Azure Container Apps. And later on in the series, we'll get to what those mean. But they give you essentially shortcuts to start developing more complex applications. And Azure handles all of the infrastructure and a lot of the code for you. But we'll talk about those in due time. So cloud computing really becomes to be computing as a commodity. It becomes cheaper. You don't have to worry about the infrastructure. You don't have to worry about the patching. You really don't have to worry about anything except for your core logic, your business application running. So you're just running your code, and that's it. So you're going to hear things when people talk about computing as a service. IaaS, infrastructure as a service. PaaS, platform as a service. Even FaaS, functions as a service, or SaaS, software as a service. All these things are as a service. So cloud computing delivers that to you as a service, taking it up to you and delivering something as a service to you. So infrastructure as a service would be like virtual machines or storage or something where it's pretty low level and you're going to be taking care of a lot of the stuff yourself. But as things go higher, like software as a service, that's almost like Microsoft 365. So Word or Outlook, a full functioning application, software as a service that you have. So things get higher along, more abstracted, more functional as well. So some of the advantages of cloud computing, especially for a .NET developer, is that we have the delivery of computing services across the internet. And so what you also have is IT infrastructure, like virtual machines or storage or databases. We're not worried about that, taking care of somebody else. And we also could have some advantages of like IoT or ML or AI. We're letting Azure handle some pretty advanced use cases that we can get for free. We can access the research and development of Microsoft and bring that into our applications without having to reinvent the wheel ourselves. So we're not really constrained by the physical infrastructure like a traditional data center. We're not hosting our servers ourselves. We're letting somebody else do it, and then we can bring in like a highly available IoT where tons of data is coming in, or we can make use of a very smart artificial intelligence starter platform and build off of that. And we don't have to worry about any patching. I can't even imagine trying to build an IoT device server infrastructure from the ground up, we can use somebody else's knowledge, Microsoft's knowledge, and build off of that. So that's some of the advantages. And then we're not really responsible for keeping the lights on. Somebody else is going to do that. Somebody else is going to keep care of the patching. Server goes down somewhere, somebody else is going to make sure that server comes back up, or it's going to fall back and our apps keep on running. We don't have to have the pagers on anymore and make sure things go on at night. And then it's easy to scale our apps too. We can add more horsepower to it. We could add more machines to it. Really, it's almost as easy as going into the Azure portal and clicking a button. There's more to it than that, but there's easy scaling to get things out across the world so our apps, when they become successful, don't just disappear and fail, that we can keep them up and keep them running. So, of course, that's cloud computing in a nutshell. Real quick of what it is, but what are some of the use cases for .NET on it? Web apps, of course. That's the first thing that you would think of. We're going to deploy a web app to Azure. Get that up and running. Almost a lift and shift from that server sitting underneath somebody's desk. Let's put that in the cloud. Let somebody else worry about keeping that server plugged in. And then web APIs themselves. So a classic REST API. They also can live both a web app and web API. We can start living in container. And we'll talk about in a future episode the advantages of having a .NET application living in a container. And now with modern .NET, we can have our apps live in Linux containers as well, which opens up a whole world of possibilities of where they can deploy to. A whole microservice architecture then can be deployed with .NET on Azure. So now we have our microservices which are responsible for one and one thing only. They're using their own database. They're completely separate from other microservices. They can be deployed separately. They are responsible for just one thing. They're using their own databases. They're easy to maintain. So one person is just responsible for it, or a whole team is just responsible for one. You're no longer having these huge monolith applications. And we can start making those and then deploying those out on Azure and have like different deployment cycles for each one. So the .NET use case then for that becomes really available to us. We can start doing message brokers. There's a whole ecosystem of message brokering applications and services up on Azure which we can build our application for and use that. So highly available time series. We can, like, if we have a bunch of messages coming in, push them up to Azure and we have services that can handle that. And then mobile backends, of course, tying in with web APIs, tying in with identity as a service with like Azure Active Directory B2C. So things like where I can log in with my social account, like something like GitHub, activate that with Azure B2C on my mobile app, then have it hit a web API to get data from, let's say, an Azure SQL database and bring that back. We can have serverless functions, which is really not quite serverless, but you can think of it as like a web API that scales down to 0 when you're not using it. And not only is it like a web API, but you can have this function that just is monitoring something like a storage queue, or it's monitoring like an Azure Cosmos DB database. So this function, you're writing and it's just looking at your code. You don't care one bit about how you have to new up something to hit Cosmos DB. You don't care how you have to new it up to respond to HTTP requests. You're just worried about writing your code, and that's it. And then we can do more complex scenarios, such as writing a web API, putting it into an Azure API management front end, which allows us to control access to our API. Things like only allowing paid subscribers to hit it, stuff like that. Or then we can allow it to export into a custom connector so Power Apps can then access it. So there's a ton of .NET use cases that we can allow and that can light up when we start doing things in Azure. And here are just a few of the Azure services that we'll talk about as we go through this whole beginner series on .NET. From app services and Azure SQL, app services are web, blob storage, managed identity, which is a way for different Azure services to talk to each other in an authenticated way, container apps, which are containers that run like in a microservice way, Azure Signal R, which is real-time communication. There are a ton of different ones that are pertinent to .NET developers, and we'll start covering those, and you'll learn how to use those and integrate those into your applications. So there's several tools that we need just to get started with it. And the first one, of course, when we're developing would be the Azure .NET SDK. So there's a whole .NET SDK out there that's used to hit at Azure services. And not only is it used to hit at Azure services, regardless of which one you're going at, it's used in roughly the same way. So it's designed to be familiar to you whether you're going to hit Cosmos DB or whether you're hitting Azure Storage. Once you know how to do one, you're going to be familiar enough where it's not this huge learning curve to hit another service with it. Of course, Visual Studio is going to be one of our main tool sets, whether you're running on Windows or Mac. VS Code, also right in there, has nice, great support for .NET developers into Azure. And then there's a whole slew of command line interfaces that you can use to get at Azure, including the Azure CLI itself, which you can run locally, Azure PowerShell, and then Azure Cloud Shell, which is a shell that runs in Azure, and you can run the Azure CLI from the Azure Cloud Shell, which is pretty amazing. And we'll take a look at that all right now. So the first thing I want to show you real quick is the Azure SDK for .NET developers. So these are all going to be NuGet packages, and they're going to be NuGet packages that you download as needed. However, there is a great documentation site to go out and grab everything and to learn more about it. So I just want to call this out right now so you can learn, if you wanted to learn real quick about what things are, that you can go out and grab it. But we'll be using that a lot throughout this series. The next thing I wanted to call out is Visual Studio Code. There's a whole tool set that's used just to access Azure and making your life easier when you get at Azure. And it's installed through the extensions portion of VS Code. And it's called, of all things, if you search for, Azure. And the Azure tooling comes with it. So it's an extension pack that's consisting of 8 different extensions, including things like App Service, Azure Functions, Storage, and so on. So I already installed everything here. And then you can get at it through this little Azure icon on the left. It gives you your subscription. And then once you open up your subscription, you can see various servers and services that you already have installed, such as a function app. Go in here and I can see the various function apps I have installed. I can right-click on it, browse to it, deploy to it, start and stop it. So it gives me a way to quickly administer really my development sites. I wouldn't want to use it to start and stop a production site, but this really tightens up my inner development loop. Now, of course, there is the big one, and that's Visual Studio. So Visual Studio has an entire Azure development kit put inside of it. And to install it, when you're going through, you can install brand new when you're installing Visual Studio, or you can go through and install it later. It's the Azure Development Workload. So you don't necessarily have to install it right away if you don't want to, but and actually you don't have to install it at all if you're using the Azure SDK, but it gives you a ton of different tooling that makes life easier. So all you need to do is check Azure Development, and then Visual Studio will either modify your existing installation, or if you're installing it from scratch, it'll put it in. Great. So that's your tooling. And then there's a couple command line interfaces I want to call out as well. The first one is the Azure CLI. So what that gives you is the Azure CLI. And so what the Azure CLI gives you is a way to interface with Azure from the command line. So I could create things such as resource groups or app services, all just from the command line. And to install it, just follow the directions on the documentation, which I'll include, of course, in the show notes, how to do that. For Windows, it's just an MSI, which you would run and installs. All right. So then finally, let's go and take a look at everything working. In Windows Terminal, PowerShell, I could do AZ, which is the Azure command line, and if I do account show, it's going to say, all right, Matt, you're logged in underneath this account. So this is just part of the, if I do AZ-H for help, it's going to show me all the commands that I could use to interact with Azure from the command line. So I can do things such as create a static web app or storage, use SQL, SignalR, all from the command line and do such things. So it becomes very, very powerful, as we'll see in a couple episodes. Now, there's this Azure command line, right? But we can do even more, and that's done through something called the Azure Cloud Shell. Now, so the Azure Cloud Shell can be accessed from a couple different spots. It can be accessed from Windows Terminal, and you can see this is the first time I'm accessing it from Windows Terminal, but the Cloud Shell can also be accessed through the Azure portal itself. Now, I already have it open, and in order to get it open, once you browse to the Azure portal, there's a little icon up top in the toolbar that looks like a terminal prompt. So you click on that and this opens. And this is a full-on shell terminal. You can see right now I'm running bash. I could run PowerShell if I wanted to. And the same thing as before. If I run AZ account show, I'm now running a full shell version of my Azure CLI. And what's neat here is this is my essential hard drive that I'm running. I can see where I am currently at home/Matt. I also have things such as Docker installed here that I can run and build Docker images or containers. I even have .NET installed. So I can get my code installed, download it to Azure, run Docker, run .NET, all from the Cloud Shell itself. And so that's what this is doing from the Windows Terminal. Windows Terminal is calling out into Azure to run the Cloud Shell. So it's not running the Azure CLI at all. What it's doing is porting out to the Cloud Shell and running it there. So I'll log in. And then once it opens up, it gives me a variety of tenants that I already have. And most of these are Azure B2C tenants, so they're not real part of my subscription. But the top one, and we'll talk about B2C in a future episode, but the top one, Microsoft, is my real one that has all my Azure resources in it. So I select that, and then that is the one I can use going forward. And so now it looks just like what I was running up in the Azure portal before, but now it's on my laptop and I can run it here, doing the same thing as I did before. And I have full access to things like Docker as well. All right, so that's our tooling. And there's one other thing I want to talk about real quick before we dive in to actually creating applications and running them on Azure. And that is naming conventions of how to organize things that we have in Azure. And really, naming conventions come down to a personal preference of how your organization wants to do things. And it could be many different ways to do it. As long as you're consistent, it's a good way. There's no right or wrong answer. And so essentially what you're going to want to do is have the type of resource as the first one. And so Microsoft has suggested for every type of resource in Azure you can create, has given an abbreviation for it. So resource type, and so this would be a web application type. So the next step would then be the application name. So this is a web resource called app called .NET Azure, where it's running, here running in East US, the environment, dev, and then the instance. So this is rather verbose, but just by looking at it, I can tell exactly what it is, which is great. And so really it's just a folder structure for me to understand everything. And so then let's go through. Let's actually create our first resource by using the Azure CLI from Windows Terminal and Cloud Shell. And so I'm logged in already, as from before. And so what I can do then is do AZ group create. So group is going to be a resource group, and it's something overall where I'm going to put other Azure resources. And so the abbreviation for resource group is RG. So now I want to figure out what my application name is. And so what we're going to be creating overall during this series is Munson's Pickle and Preserves, a product review site where we see a bunch of products. We're able to give it reviews. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. So we'll just call it RG Munson. Then after that, we could put down where it's located. Like if it was in East US, we could put down whether it's a dev and then an instance. So I'm going to say East US dev-001. So again, as long as I'm consistent, that's all that matters. So if I didn't want to call it East US or if I didn't want to put in dev, I didn't have to. But for here, that's what I'll do. So at first look, I can know what's going on. So that's the name. And I want to make sure I give it the option of -G of saying the name for it. And then the option of -L of locating where it is. So once I do that, it tells me that I provision, okay, and now I should be good to go. I'll go back into the Azure portal. Go look at all my resource groups. And I'll have to refresh probably a couple times in order to see it pop up. And here it is. RG Munson, East US, and nothing's in it quite yet, but in future episodes, that's what we'll be doing. So there we have it, a brief overview of really what is cloud computing, where .NET fits into that, and then some tooling that we can create, that we can use for creating our apps within Azure, including Visual Studio, VS Code, the specific tooling for that, and then also some CLI tooling. And then we saw a quick creation with the naming conventions of our resource group. So in our next episode, we're going to be talking about actually deploying a web app with database access to this resource group. And then we're going to start looking at how to create this Munson's Pickle and Preserves web app.